Hello again, Des Asante from the Tech Muse Academy with yet another mixlessons.com video quick tip. This one comes to us again from a question that was posed by a fellow GearSlutz member, and it concerns panning and stereo tracks. He says, I'm often recording something to stereo tracks from a motif keyboard which has stereo outs, including drums, bass, and synth. It's easy to pan mono tracks, but with stereo tracks you have to decide on two pan knobs. It's very difficult to decide. For example, bass, you could pan left 100%, right 100%, or left 0 and right 0, which means centered. Or even something like left 20 and right 20. I don't understand clearly how the sound works when you pan left 100, right 100 versus left 0, right 0, etc., etc. I feel when it's centered, it's like a dot that gives more gain, while the full left and full right is more wide and quote-unquote 3D. What do you think is the better situation? Have you practiced? Well, there's a couple of ways to approach this, and right off the bat, there's no single definitive correct way. It really does boil down to your creative expression and what you're trying to achieve with that track in your mix. The most important thing to consider is your three-dimensional strategy, including your panorama strategy. And I think that's a better place to begin. And when you start to flesh out exactly what you want to do with the elements in your mix, in your panorama, then a lot of these questions will answer themselves. I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. This is an example of a 3D strategy that I put together for a mix that I did for a client some time ago. And I put this together just to illustrate the concept of three-dimensional mixing and how you can plan things out. If you look at this, I've got in the green box in the center, I've got my sort of sacred center instruments, your vocal, any features, your bass, snare, kick drum, and things of that nature. One thing to consider is when it comes to bass and kick, any of those low frequency elements, it's advantageous to place those in the center. In other words, make them mono and have them coming equally out of both speakers. Part of the reason is that those high energy, low frequencies, they perform best when the drivers of your speakers are moving in sync with one another, okay? And then of course features like the vocal and things of that nature. The snare drum oftentimes, which is a driving rhythmic element, those types of things I prefer to keep in the center, and I don't believe I'm alone in that preference. When we start to consider the other elements of our mix, this is where we can start to put together our panning strategy. So you can see in this demonstration I have my room mics in stereo, but not quite as wide as, say, some other element in the mix. I've got these hand claps. That was a group of 5 or 6 people clapping in certain sections of the tune that are also in stereo, but again, a little bit less wide than the room mics. So this is an example of when you could use that stereo dual panner and pan them in a little bit. So maybe you're, left 40, right 40, not 100% wide, full hard left and right, but just narrowed in a little bit, but still having a stereo perspective to them. With my room mics, they might be hard left and hard right, so they're stereo but wider. Again, this is not a rule. This is just how I chose to approach this particular mix. Okay, so what to do if you have captured a stereo sound from your motif, as you say, but you don't want it to be necessarily stereo, like bass, for example. Well, let me show you how I approach that. So here what I have is a little synth bass thing that I generated from Omnisphere. And as you can see here, it's stereo. There's the left channel, there's the right channel, okay? If I want to, as I mentioned, use the technique I was describing where my bass frequencies, I want them to be mono, so my drivers are pushing and pulling at the exact same time, then what I would do is I would convert this track into a mono track. And the way it's done, at least in Cubase, and you'll find similar functionality in whatever DAW you use, is to export that track as a mono mix. So let me demonstrate that for you. So I'm going to grab an audio mix down from this track. I'm going to call it synth mono. And I'm going to export it as a WAV file at the bit depth and sample rate that I'm using in this project. I'm going to import it into an audio track in my session, and I'm going to click this button right here, which is the mono down mix. Okay, and I'll hit export, and you'll see in a moment what happens when the computer's finished crunching its numbers. So now what I have is the same track, but as you can see now, it's mono information. And if I solo that and play it, you'll hear what that sounds like. Okay. All right, so a simple little mono bass line. And then what I can do is I can take that stereo version and I can mute it at the track level. And what I like to do in Cubase, just for organizational purposes, is I like to create a folder track, and I'll call that folder backup, in case I do change my mind and I want to revisit that later. And I can put this stereo track inside that folder, close it up, shrink it up, and it's out of the way. And now I've got my mono track, which I can either leave mono, or I can then pan to the left and to the right and treat it as a mono source. Okay, so the moral of the story is you'll have to make your own decision as to how you want to treat the panorama in your mix. But this is a method that allows you to take a stereo audio file, turn it into a mono audio file, and then you have a single panner that you can then choose where in your horizontal spectrum you'd like that element to sit. So I hope that you find that somewhat helpful, and we will see you on the next quick tip.